Good evening, everyone. If I can have your this is a great crowd, isn't it? This is huge. I want to thank you all for coming. Let's give yourselves a round of applause for figuring out how to sit down. It's terrific to be together with so many friends and family and colleagues of Cedric Suzman tonight. This is going to be a fabulous evening. The co-chair, I'm Charles Shapiro, I'm the president of the World Affairs Council. If I haven't met you yet, right after dinner, please find me and say hello. I'm delighted to have you here. I'm delighted to have Wayne Lord, my predecessor, here. Wayne, raise your hands. Everybody see. Here he is, right here. I was the guy who was fortunate enough to inherit all the good work that Wayne and Cedric have done, and so I want to thank them very much. The co-chairs of tonight's dinner are David Abney, the CEO of UPS, who we're in his house. I want to thank you, David, and all your UPS colleagues. If Christmas presents get delivered late, it's because y'all are here tonight. I want to thank you for taking a break. Well, he says we'll be okay. Mark Becker, the president of Georgia State University. Mark, raise your hand. Clyde Tuggle, who's the senior vice president of the Coca-Cola Company, who's over here. The other co-chair is Dennis Lockhart, who's the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He's not here tonight, though. He's in Washington raising interest rates at this very moment, right? Right? But the dinner sponsors tonight are SunTrust Bank. Bo Cummins is here. There's a SunTrust table here, I think. And Andrew and Ruth Suzman. Andrew, you may notice a similarity of names. It's not a coincidence. Andrew is Cedric's son, and Andrew and his wife have contributed generously to make this take place tonight. So Andrew, thank you very much. The major contributors to tonight's dinner are UPS, the Coca-Cola Company, AJC International, over here having a good time, and Deloitte. And we've got a number of individual sponsors who I am not going to read all their names, but they're all listed in your program. They're all fabulous, smart, wonderful, and handsome people. We've got, among the dignitaries tonight are two consuls general. My good friend, Hermano Teles Ribeiro, the Consul General of Brazil, is here. And Nagesh Singh, who is the Consul General of India, there. And of course, our featured speaker tonight is Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who will get introduced later. You'll see his bio, but Stu, I want to thank you so much for flying down from Washington for this. Stu's an old friend of Cedric.
Thomas Wolfe wrote a book called You Can't Come Home Again. But when I come back to my hometown of Atlanta, I know that you can. I feel as if I have never left. I was weaned on Coca-Cola, and decades later chaired its International Advisory Board, and seeing my dear friend Clyde Tuggle here evokes wonderful memories. I served for almost 10 years on the board of UPS, and being with its great CEO, Dave Abney, is a special pleasure. Every turn of the corner when I come back to Atlanta evokes memories. And just in this audience alone, is someone who was my prom date at Grady High School, Sherry Frank. A number of people now with Rogers and Hardin, but who had been with Paul Goldstein, with whom I practiced law. And I have to say, on a sad note, as I always do when I come to Atlanta, going to Greenwood Cemetery, where my wife lays at rest. So Atlanta is in my blood. It's a great city, and it is a particular honor to be here with Cedric. When he came in 1974, we formed an instant bond of friendship, and his contribution in bringing international affairs to the business community of Atlanta has made an indelible mark for the good, and came, by the way, just at the time, least we forget, when Andy Young brought the Olympics here. And that was really the takeoff stage for Atlanta as an international community. So Cedric, it's an honor to be with you and with your family. We're living in an era in which there are multiple threats to the established world order that we were the leaders in creating. A world order that promoted democracy and freedom, free markets and tolerance, global integration, and respect for national borders. In the post-war period, it was our great country which created all the institutions which undergird that world order. For all its imperfections, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the OSCE, NATO, these were all American-led, American-bred institutions that have helped create a more stable, more prosperous, more tolerant world. We rebuilt war-torn Europe, to which I was ambassador during the Clinton administration through the Marshall Fund, and we've supported in a selfless way, even though it might make them a greater competitor of ours, greater integration and expansion of the European Union. Our vision of this global world order seemed more validated than ever when 25 years ago the Berlin Wall fell and communism ended. Just this week I was at the German embassy, and they have a whole series of programs with the title 25 Years of Unity. I mean, least we forget, we now have, for the first time in world history, a European continent that was torn for centuries and centuries in war. We have, under one umbrella, united the West and the East of Europe under democratic, free market principles through the European Union. And when that wall fell, for a few golden years, it appeared there would be a Pax Americana. We were the sole global superpower, benignly towering over the world and able to extend our vision of American and Western values to the world. One academic famously called it the end of history. But now, in the second decade of the 21st century, much of this world order seems torn asunder by multiple revolutionary changes. Instead of a new world order, we seem to have a new world disorder. I'd like to try to sort out some of these revolutionary changes, challenging our vision of a stable world order, but to do so with more optimism than one would glean from reading the headlines. The first of these dramatic and revolutionary changes that has occurred over this last 25 years is a truly historic shift of power from the United States and Europe to the countries of the East and the South, countries which have a different value set. And there are a couple of unique features to this shift in the balance of power. The first is that the United States, since our founding as a republic, has always been an ascending power, not initially, of course, the most powerful, but certainly after World War II and then the Cold War, the most powerful in the world. Now we find that our leadership in every field is challenged, most obviously by China. China has the world's fastest superconductor. It's the leading producer of steel and autos, aluminum and wind turbines, and solar panels, and almost humorously, recently overtook Italy as the world's premier manufacturer of violins. It has the largest foreign reserves of American dollars in the world. In the space of only 15 or 20 years, and I was at the White House when Deng Xiaoping, all 4'11" of them, came to the White House when we normalized relations. And they came almost as supplicants. And now they're the second most powerful economy and most powerful military. They've created a new development bank in Asia, competing with the World Bank, which was our creation. And lo and behold, our own European allies become charter members. And as I'll discuss in a moment, they're rapidly modernizing their military and building out the South China Sea, and as a member of the Secretary of Defense's Defense Policy Board, I see this firsthand. But there's another unique feature to this big shift in influence and power. And that is that in the past, of course, there have been changes from Spain to the Netherlands to France to England over the centuries, but usually from one to another after a major battle like Trafalgar. What's new about this shift of power is the multiplicity of countries that are now having their day in the sun. The so-called BRIC countries, Brazil and Russia, India and China, the Asian tigers, Indonesia, Turkey, South Korea, all are elevating at the same time. And that enormously complicates our ability to create a stable world order based on our values. We have to do things in coalitions. We simply can't snap our fingers and make them happen. But there is, again, a positive notion to this shift. It's happening, it's irreversible, but it's not catastrophic. And it's not catastrophic for a couple of reasons. First of all, we are not a beached whale like England was after World War II, depleted. We are unique in our capacity for innovation, for creativity, for IPOs, for having the Intels and the Facebooks and the Microsofts and all the new social media companies. We have unparalleled universities today, right now, 2015, there are 100,000 Chinese studying in our universities, including a majority of the children and grandchildren of the Politburo in China. And we have one other resource that is a potential game changer. and that is even with depressed oil prices, which are certainly taking a toll, through American fracking technology, hydraulic fracturing, we've learned that in North Dakota alone there is more oil in shale rock than in all of Saudi Arabia. And we've got the technology to develop that oil and that natural gas so that within the next 5 years, we will be the #1 producer of natural gas and the #1 producer overtaking Russia and Saudi Arabia of crude oil. And we'll be exporting it instead of being dependent on OPEC to import it. This is absolutely revolutionary. And Wayne, when you started this council, this would have been an unimaginable thing. We were all suffering from our dependence on OPEC. But there's another positive role to this, and that is we tend to see China as a sort of absolute superpower that gets its way in the world. The fact is, China has more than its share of problems. Yes, they're the second largest economy in the world, but on a per capita basis, they're about 100th in per capita income. They have tens of thousands of demonstrations against corruption and pollution. Their closed political system doesn't allow the kind of creativity we have, which is why they try to steal it from our companies through cyber attacks. I wouldn't trade our position for theirs any day of the week. More broadly, amidst the seeming chaos, we've learned to create coalitions. Indeed, with China on global warming, and with the P5+1 on the nuclear agreement with Iran. More on that in a minute. The second great phenomenon is globalization, powered by the digital revolution, by which I mean the dramatic flow of capital, goods, services, and yes, as we've seen, people across national boundaries. And for sure, there are dark sides to globalization. Terrorist groups can use it to recruit and fund their organizations. Authoritarian governments like China or Iran can block their citizens from the full access to the internet. And as we'll discuss in a minute, cyber attacks are a danger. But I want to suggest to you that by any net basis, globalization is a tremendous positive for the United States and the West because it is creating a more interconnected, interdependent world. Out of 7 billion people on this globe, 4 billion use mobile devices, and 2 billion are connected to the internet. 20% of all of Kenya's GDP goes over cell phones. And now rural villages in Africa can connect to global markets, to telemedicine. They can take courses at Harvard and MIT. And by creating a more interdependent world, we create a safer world. I don't have to tell Coca-Cola and UPS and the other great companies in this room that we now have global supply chains. There's no such thing as an American product or a European product or a Chinese product. I mean, I'm probably the last person, I think Steve Fox is still here, who's using a BlackBerry. But look at your iPhone. People say, well, it's a Chinese product. It's made by Foxconn. No, it's assembled by Foxconn. Its inputs come from 7 different countries, and less than 15% of its value is Chinese. If that supply chain breaks down, China suffers, 7 countries suffer. We're all in this together. It makes traditional warfare unimaginable because of this remarkable interdependence. And that's a good thing. And another good thing about globalization is that our own DNA as a country is precisely what's necessary to succeed in this new globalized era. Our capacity for innovation and creativity is really, in essence, what will make our success possible in a globalized era. The third challenge comes from non-traditional threats: climate change and the concomitant water crisis, cyber warfare, and nuclear proliferation. So let's look quickly at those three. I was the lead U.S. negotiator in the Clinton administration for the Kyoto Global Warming Protocol. And we did a good job of getting the Europeans, the Japanese, and other industrial countries to take commensurate reductions. But we failed to get a buy-in from China and India and the developed countries who said, don't tell us to take reductions. You created this problem with global warming in your industrial era. We're just starting our industrialization. Don't even think about it. And what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, culminating yesterday in Paris, is a light years change in that attitude, started by the U.S.-China bilateral agreement, in which now all the countries, 195 countries, are taking reductions, or at least reducing the levels of their increase. And there is a self-monitoring device. It's not as strong as one would like, but each 5 years, countries have to come back and have their commitments measured, and there will be reputational damage if they don't succeed. This very week, last week, just in the middle of the negotiations, China declared its first red alert, meaning that literally no one in Beijing could go out of the house to work or to school because the pollution from coal burning was so awful. That's why China's come to the table. That's why India will come to the table. And there's a great story here, and UPS and Coca-Cola are part of it, I know. Because, David, one of the things you did is you established a global emissions footprint for UPS, and Coca-Cola's done the same thing. You took a net neutrality commitment on water. Now, I have to tell you, between my work at Kyoto and the work in Paris, we have really deteriorated. Ice fields are melting, water supplies are threatened, sea levels are rising. We're nowhere near being able to reach the 2.6 degrees Celsius ceiling. We're on the way to exceed it, which scientists say is the tipping point. So Paris has got to work. We've got to make it work. It's something for our children and our grandchildren. And I believe it will work, and I think Paris is an enormous positive step forward. Second, in these non-traditional fields is cyber attacks. Again, with companies here, I don't need to tell you the danger of cyber attacks. I know my own profile is now in Chinese hands because 20 million people on the Federal Office of Personnel Management had their whole database stolen. They have my Social Security card and everything else. Leon Panetta, when he was Secretary of Defense, talked about the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor. Now, we're not talking about Star Wars in the 22nd century, all right? We're talking about here and now. Russia used a cyber attack against Latvia when they invaded it. They used it against Ukraine. Every day of every week, companies are threatened with cyber attacks. It is a very real and present danger. But, again, there are some positives. We need new rules of the game. We don't have any rules of the game. When is a cyber attack an act of warfare? We know when somebody goes across a border, it may be, but when is it here? We don't have those rules yet, but in the recent summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping of China just a few months ago, they pledged, and we'll see if they honor it, there's some evidence they are, that they will now have no cyber attacks against private corporations. The third of these new security threats is the threat of nuclear proliferation. There was an era after the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty when things were going all the right way. Argentina, Brazil, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, South Africa, and even Libya under Gaddafi unbundled their nuclear programs and ended them. This began to go the wrong way in the 1990s when both India and Pakistan developed nuclear weapons. Pakistan is the fastest growing nuclear power, and of course North Korea uses and brandishes this nuclear weapon to get attention. But here again there is actually reason for optimism, because the greatest near-term threat is Iran. The notion of putting in the hands of the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard a nuclear weapon is an unthinkable proposition. And for all the flaws, and I know them very well, I've headed for 5 years the Iran Task Force of the Atlantic Council. I've met 3 times in private meetings with the Foreign Minister Zarif, who's the chief negotiator. I know all the flaws in the agreement. I want to tell you it's a hell of a lot better than no agreement. It's going to reduce the number of centrifuges by 2/3. It's going to have 24/7 inspections with cameras. It's going to end the plutonium plant at Iraq. And it gives us time to hope we can bring Iran around, but we can't depend on that. We have to assume they're going to cheat. And so we need to arm Israel and our Arab allies with all the arms they need to defend themselves, and we're doing so. And we need to say today, not 10 years from now when the agreement ends, that if you try to get a nuclear weapon at any time during or after the 10-year period, we will use every resource at our disposal, including military arms, to stop it. The last challenge is the one, of course, we're all confronted with every day as we wake up. You know, I'm reminded of Chief Justice Warren's statement that the first thing he does when he got the newspaper, and I still do it, is turn to the sports section so he can see man's achievements rather than his foibles. But when you look at the headlines, it really is a very disturbing situation. And so this last challenge is the struggle for the direction of the 1.6 billion Muslims, 1.6 billion Muslims out of 7 billion people in this world. And the direction that the Muslim world takes will speak volumes to the world in which we will live and our children and our grandchildren will live. And this has, of course, been heightened so recently by Islamic terrorism from Beirut to Mali to Paris, where I just returned from, and now San Bernardino. And this, in turn, is closely related to a totally new phenomenon that is an enormous threat to the global order. And that is the disappearance, particularly in the Middle East, of the nation state. So what we're seeing now is the total collapse of nations that were created after World War I and the Versailles Treaty, the Iraqs and the Syrias, based on totally artificial lines created by the French and the British, throwing together disparate ethnic and Shiite and Sunni groups with very poor senses of national identification. And as the autocrats which control those countries have now collapsed in the misnamed Arab Spring. Nature and physics abhors a vacuum, but so does politics. And the vacuum created by the elimination of those autocrats has created a space into which non-state actors have appeared. This is a term no one knew about 20 years ago. They have taken on the aspects of a state. Now, I mentioned that I'm on the Defense Policy Board, so we had a briefing quite recently on ISIS. Try Googling ISIS. You won't find a reference before 2013. Nobody heard of ISIS. And so we had 4 intelligence briefers from 4 different intelligence agencies to start our Defense Policy Board. And they said we made 2 mistakes. We started looking at ISIS in 2013. We tried to get policymakers interested in it. We failed. But we made 2 mistakes. The first is we overestimated the capacity of the Iraq army that we had funded to the tens of billions of dollars to stand up when ISIS came, even though they outnumbered ISIS 10 and 20 to 1. They melted like butter in a hot desert of Iraq, leaving, by the way, our arms behind. And the second thing they said is we underestimated ISIS's command and control capacity. This is not a ragtag group of militias. Many of them are former Saddam Hussein officers. They understand command and control, and they're extremely sophisticated, and now they're using social media. They've got cells in at least 8 different countries, and sympathizers, as we've seen everywhere in the world, including in California. This, of course, is not the only threat to nation states. Who would have thought, after the 1975 Helsinki Agreement signed by the Soviet Union, assuring the inviolability of borders in Europe, that a post-Soviet Russian government would violate the borders of Ukraine, literally just grabbing Crimea, destabilizing eastern Ukraine. And now what's happening again, we had this in our briefing in the South China Defense Policy Board. What China's doing is they're taking coral reefs and rocks in the South China Sea, and they're building islands on them. And not just islands, they're building runways that can take sophisticated military planes, and they're going to claim sovereignty over the whole South China Sea. But let's go back to the Middle East, because that is what is occupying us now. And I want to give you some specific prescriptive ideas. But I want to suggest to you that this has multiple ripple effects, this ISIS and jihadist violence. It's creating fear on the part of our own publics. It's changing the politics of Western democracies. It's eroding the center. So you've got right-wing extremist parties coming up in places like Greece, even in the UK, even in France. It's creating a populist sense that's anti-trade, anti-immigrant. This has very profound ripple effects. I want to suggest to you that this is not simply what Samuel Huntington at Harvard called a war of civilizations, the Muslim world against the West. We must not think of it in those terms, or we will lead to that very war. It is more a civil war within the Muslim world, although it certainly has aspects of a war of civilizations. There are many more, many more Muslims killing Muslims. This is a war of Shiites against Sunnis, of modernizers against fundamentalists, of people in the Arab world who want to join this globalized world against those who want to destroy it. And our job is to strengthen the moderates and go after the extremists with great force, but not to lump the two together. We must not lump the two together. So let me suggest in closing a few very specific proposals of how to deal with this jihadist threat. If you think we have a threat, the Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, recently said that there are 3,000 French-born Muslims fighting today in Iraq and Syria, 1,000 of whom have come back to France, armed, trained, radicalized, and there are perhaps 100 American Muslims now fighting in Syria and Iraq. And if you look at the terrible violence in Paris, those 6 simultaneously attacks, they fit exactly that profile. People who went out, came back. Same thing happened with the Jewish Museum in Brussels, which 3 people were killed. Exact same profile. We need to gird our loins for a very long battle, but we can and we will succeed. And here are some concrete things we can do. First, Europe has to strengthen its woefully inadequate intelligence sharing. It has to maintain airline records for longer periods of time. It has to impose stricter external border controls. If you are from a so-called Schengen state in the EU, which allows the same free passage you'd have as go from Alabama to Georgia, and you go out of the Schengen zone, even to Syria, you can come back in the Schengen zone with almost no check. People don't go to Syria and Iraq for vacations. Europe also has to reach out affirmatively to bring their homegrown Muslims into the mainstream of education and job training and employment to reduce the temptation of radical Islam for young European-based Muslims. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have to be told directly and forcibly it is unacceptable for them to send radical imams abroad to preach a Wahhabi brand of Islam, to fund extremist groups in schools and mosques around the world, as they are now doing. The King of Morocco, a very moderate Muslim country where I spend a good deal of time, has taken forceful steps to keep these radical imams out of their mosques. Moderate Muslims, of whom the vast majority of the Muslims are moderate, have to redouble their efforts to educate their young people that the Quran does not require violence, to teach tolerance toward non-Muslims, and to speak out and stand up and be heard against radicals. Turkey has to seal its border with Syria, over which many radical recruits cross. Iraq has to empower its Sunni minority, or they will simply support fellow Sunni ISIS against a central Shiite government they don't trust. And here's where we come in, the United States of America. We have to take the lead to destroy ISIS root and branch, to dismantle its infrastructure in Syria and Iraq. We cannot fight this fight for the Arab countries alone. We can't convert this into a battle between the U.S. and ISIS. But what we can do and must do is provide more training and more assistance. We can establish a safe zone, a no-fly zone in northern Syria to keep the waves of immigrants out. And I can tell you that this is an epic migration we have never seen since World War II. We've got 2 million people coming out of Syria, overwhelming Turkey, overwhelming Jordan, overwhelming the European Union. We've got to find ways to stop it, certainly by trying to negotiate a peace in Syria. That's one thing, but that's going to be tough. We should establish safe havens so people don't feel they have to leave Syria, and they'll be protected. We should increase from 3,500 to 10,000 the number of U.S. military personnel in Iraq, not as combat forces, but to increase our training and logistics support and to provide more accurate intelligence for our drone attacks. And we should increase the number of special forces in Syria from 50 to many more than that. We need to increase the intensity of our bombing of ISIS sites in Syria and Iraq. Already this year, we've had 8,000 airstrikes against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Just within the last week, the Pentagon has proposed something very creative, and that is they've sent to the White House a proposal to create a number of small bases for special operations and intelligence operations around the Middle East and Africa in those very same areas where ISIS is trying to establish their own networks. Congress beats its chest and wants more action, and yet they won't give the President the clear legal authority to use all military means to pursue ISIS. We also have to dismantle the financial base that allows ISIS to plan these attacks by cutting off their oil resources and their capacity to sell looted antiquities. Here there is again some good news, because the U.S. and Russia are now negotiating what I think will be a unanimous UN resolution aimed at cutting off ISIS funding based on the ones we passed in 1999 to target the financing of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. We should also encourage our social media companies to shut down sites that promote violence. But what we must not do is to treat all Muslims as if they're enemies through registration of Muslim citizens, through restricting all Muslim immigration. This would be handing ISIS a victory and would throw more moderates into the hands of radicals, thinking that the West felt that all Muslims were a threat. The last positive notion, and that is ISIS is not invincible. We've killed Osama bin Laden and dismantled his Afghan operation. They are such a threat that now we're finding that disparate countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia and France and even Iran are willing to cooperate, recognizing their dangers. Moreover, the reverses that the Iraqi army has had, which I mentioned, are now themselves being reversed. They're beginning to successfully fight. They've retaken Sinjar and an oil refinery at Baji. They're entering ISIS-controlled Ramadi. And with our training, they're trying to retake captured ISIS areas in Mosul, Fallujah, and Hawazin. In the space of 6 months, ISIS controlled a third of all Iraq, and now a third of that third has been retaken by the central government. I think one of the reasons you're seeing these acts of terrorism abroad is because they realize that they're having trouble in their own home site. So in all of these areas, there is room for hope, real room for hope. real reason for optimism. And the basic reason for optimism is the United States of America. We have the will, we have the capacity, we have the resources. Our greatest threat is our polarization politically. And I hope as we go into an election cycle that we'll look for candidates who can unite this country. We've got great threats, but we have great opportunities. We're going to succeed in all of these areas. And I want to suggest to you that I think in many ways, what Cedric Suzman has meant, and Wayne, you and your colleagues, now Clad and David and others with the World Affairs Council, is you're bringing all of these issues to this great city. That's a great accomplishment, and it's one I'm proud to be a part of this evening. So as we say in our vernacular, may you go from strength to strength and rest on a job well done. Thank you.